Welcome, everybody. Let's start. So this is a panel on here, there, everywhere. Does MaaS need mobility hubs? Do we need physical and spatial cues to understand and use shared mobility? Again, if you look over my shoulder, that's a huge physical cue that tells you, oh, cars are the way to go. Are we missing out on the power of human and spatial memory when we design digitally driven transportation? This session will look at the role of place, space, and location in making shared use mobility accessible to everyone. I'll be your MC, but I won't be around. I'll start off the conversation with our panelists, Antonia Roberts, the Deputy Chief Executive of CoMoUK, Dr. Robin Mazumder, who is an environmental neuroscientist, Nico Larco, Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Oregon and Director of the Urbanism Next Center, Co-Director of the Sustainable Cities Institute, again at the University of Oregon, and Zabe, the Director of Design, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Let me welcome our panelists and ask them to briefly describe themselves physically. I'll start with me and visually how you look. I am an Asian man with dark rimmed glasses and short hair, wearing a white shirt. Antonia?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm a white, middle-aged woman with long brown hair.
Zabe?
I'm a Black, also middle-aged woman with dark brown hair.
Nico?
I am a white, Latino, middle-aged, probably on the older side of middle-aged man with graying beards and clear glasses.
And Robin?
I am a brown, South Asian, 35-year-old man, so close to middle age, wearing glasses and a gray shirt.
Thank you, everyone. So here's my first prompt question, and I will ask Zabe to start it off answering this one. How important is physical infrastructure in telling us how can we move and how should we move through the city?
I think it's critical. The physical infrastructure sets the tone for how people move through the city, what speed they move through the city, the perception of safety that people will have, the amount of lighting, not just how fast the cars are going and how they interact with each other, but also it sets your priorities. It tells people how they should move, what modes are more important, and what modes are given that level of priority and the level of performance that we need. The other component that I think is really critical that we sometimes miss is when we design physical infrastructure that is counter to our policy, we're basically setting people up for a gotcha situation. And that really doesn't help to make sure that people are using the infrastructure that we design according to our goals and our values. And it creates a sort of tension between the user and the road. And that's definitely not what we want to see.
I get jump. So we're just, oh, you're going. Sorry. I thought we were freestyling.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll jump in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, following up a little bit, or building on what Zabe was saying, we are physical beings. I mean, we exist in the physical world. And as much as like all of our conversations right now and about when we think about transportation seem to be around the technology and the digital piece, we are physical beings. So it's not an either or with the physical and the digital, but really a both and they need to support each other. As Zabe said, the physical on the one hand tells us what is possible, right? We look out and when I step out of my house, I look on the street and it tells me a little bit of what kinds of things I might be able to do. If I see a scooter sitting around, I might actually think like, oh, a scooter is possible. If I see a bus stop, I might actually think, oh, there's a bus stop. But it also tells us what's desirable and what makes the most sense. So I was lucky enough to live in the Netherlands a couple of years back. And yes, you step out of your door anywhere and there's such great infrastructure for bicycles that you automatically think like, oh yeah, bicycles is something I should be doing. As opposed to, Benji's, as he was mentioning in the introduction, the image behind him, if you step out and you see enormous roads and, danger in every other mode, then you're going to think like, I need to get in a car. So yeah, absolutely. Our physical space defines a lot of what we see as possible. And the really nice thing about the digital is that it can expand beyond specifically what we see in physical. I think that's one of the benefits we're all trying to get to, right? So that I look on my app and realize like, oh, I could do it by this other mode, which isn't necessarily maybe apparent to me, but might make things a lot easier or cheaper or faster or one of these things. But the physical is one of those automatic cues, and I think we want to be, we react much more to that, and we want to be present in that all the time. I'll pass it over to, I think we talked about Antonia going next, but I'm happy either way.
Thanks, Nico. Yeah, I completely agree with the points already made. I think quite often, if you want to use sustainable modes, it might be difficult to even be able to find them. I know this particularly for car sharing schemes. Cars are quite often hidden in the bottom of parking lots or behind the back of buildings, and certainly not in places which are particularly desirable. So first of all, we need to kind of carve out the space and make sure these things that we can find them. And then that they're kind of conveniently located, particularly for people switching between different modes. Quite often we see trip chaining between different types of modes, and so we need to make those convenient and integrated physically, but also integrated sort of visually. So it's really intuitive as to how to use these systems, and you can move between them really easily. My kind of third point is about the quality of the space that we house our sustainable modes in. This is absolutely key. They can't just be there. They need to be a pleasant experience, one where you're not going to get lost. You're not going to feel stressed. You understand how to use it, but actually you enjoy using it, using those modes, because we're competing. The bottom line is we're competing with the private car, so it's got to be pleasant, relaxing, and entertaining, really. So I think that probably leads well to Robin and some of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Antonia. So a few points. I mean, Zabe mentioned the perception of safety. That's something that I think we can look at from a number of perspectives, from physical infrastructure, keeping us physically safe from vehicles when we're riding our bikes, or when I was in Mexico City, I did some work with the World Bank, and they were doing a project on gender and transit, and really examining the experiences of women on transit. And so you kind of get into this other realm of safety that just goes beyond, physical protection. And I think that needs to be considered in the design of infrastructure itself. Nico brought up the fact that we were physical beings, and he talked about having, like seeing options in your environment. And for my dissertation, I looked into the work of a cognitive scientist named J.J. Gibson, who did work on affordances. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that term. Architects use it, but essentially it's a number of ways something can be used. And when you use that lens on an environment, the physical cues are extremely important, because you don't know how something can be used if it's not evident or intuitive, which I think, Antonia spoke to, was an intuitive approach to infrastructure. And using language like pleasant and stress, pleasantness and stress are things that we look at in environmental psychology and environmental neuroscience. So overall, I think it's exciting that the digital can interface with the physical, but the physical infrastructure, even at the simplicity of a map. When I was in London, one of my friends worked for the City of London's office, mayor's office, and they used an environmental psychological approach to orientation, and how do you really show someone where they are in a city with a physical map, acknowledging that not everyone, in today's society has access to Google Maps or any of the other technologies. So how do you kind of create a compromise or an intermediary between the digital and the physical? So yeah, those are my thoughts.
A bit a little bit on what Robin was saying. I mean, one of the things you think about is when I go to a new place, I am like so subservient to my apps, right? So I'm looking at like, where is that thing? How do I get there? All these things, right? When I move around in my typical day, I rarely ever open an app to move, right? Because I know the things I'm going, and I know more or less what the options are. And I know, from my house, I can bike, I could Uber, I can like take the bus. I know which buses there are. I know more or less when they come. I know the MaaS is nearby. So it's really the physical cues almost become more important in the everyday habitual travel, I'd say, more so than, when we're in places that we don't know, or we're doing a trip that's not a typical trip. Yeah, our apps are going to guide us more. But most of the time, we're doing trips that we do all the time. And, I know, like, definitely in my life, I feel this, and some, a lot of the research we've done, you see this as well, that people choose between different modes, for the same trip, right? Once you get out of the car, it becomes much more flexible. Like, oh yeah, I could do it this way, I could do it that way. And so the designing places that, as I mentioned before, like give you that option on the one hand, but also make that option easy and convenient. Building off a little bit of what Robin was saying before, way back when I was working as an architect, and we would do buildings, and we were working on dorms, and you'd want people to take the stairs, not the elevators, and you just design it so the elevators exist. They're just not that easily accessible, right? They're not the first thing you see. You have to like go around a corner, and it's kind of there, but when you walk right in, that stair is right in front of you. You take that, and that's, I think, what we want to do for all the modes that we're trying to have really in the lead, all the more sustainable, equitable modes.
I don't know if this is something that you're seeing in America, but we're beginning in the UK to look at new housing developments where the parking spaces aren't right outside the house, even on houses as opposed to flats, and that the parking might be in a parking barn or a lot at the edge of the development, but closer to you in a pedestrianised area, you would have access to shared cycles and and the shared cars, etc. would be ahead of getting to the cars. So you can still own a car if you really want to. It might cost you more, but the first thing you're seeing when you come out your door is all the other choices, and they're much easier to then switch on to, rather than default into the car.
And I think one thing we haven't talked about quite yet is just the lasting effect of physical infrastructure. I can pass a law, or I can set up a program or something like that, or I can even put bodies on the street, with these ambassador programs or enforcement or what have you. But it's not the same as having a physically welcoming and convenient environment greeting me when I walk out of my door. And it doesn't last as long, right? Because you can pull funding for those things. Those are operational. You can change your policy or what have you. But it takes a little bit longer to change the physical environment. There are certainly ways around that. But I think that's another reason that we really do need to make sure that we're integrating our policies and our programming and our technology with that physical environment, because it is an actual physical representation of what we care about and what we're funding. And it lasts longer, and it sets the tone for a longer period of time. And it also signals to other users that this is how we want our physical environment and our mobility and our urban spaces to function.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the lasting effects of infrastructure, particularly when you consider cycling infrastructure or the width of a road that has implications on your psychological experience. And if we make bad decisions or decisions that aren't informed by trying to really take the human experience into account, then we're left with these things until they fall apart, or someone decides to remove them, which has happened in cities I've lived in with cycling infrastructure, because the community didn't like it. So that was really interesting to me. And the other thing that I think is really important, and this is something that I observed when I was in Mexico. So I was in Mexico for the last 6 months, and I'm on my way back home now that I'm allowed back into Canada. It's been pretty interesting. And I was in 5 cities, and I spent most of my time in Mexico City, and I didn't ride a bike for 6 months. I was actually terrified because I had no idea what I was doing. There was some cycling infrastructure, but I didn't want to get spit out onto some massive road. And then, but when I was in Guadalajara, I noticed that they started, there's some cycling infrastructure there, but they replaced some parking spots with bike parking. And I thought that was amazing. I mean, obviously not just for access, but for what I think Zabe used the word signal. What did that signal in terms of our priorities, and how do you normalize these types of moving around just by the sheer physicality of the urban environment?
Yeah, I also wanted to pick up something that you mentioned earlier, which is sort of gender equity of how people move through spaces, and just talk more broadly about equity in that regard, because I think another component about the physical design of a place is that it should be anyway more egalitarian, right? You don't have biases that are brought in by people who have to do physical enforcement, or obviously armed enforcement, which can create problems and biases of their own perception. But if you set the tone for how you want people to move through a different space, then we really see it and experience it differently, and we remove some of those biases. And certainly we remove the possibility of an impact on individuals who look like me, quite honestly.
I think we certainly had feedback from the development of mobility hubs in Germany that there is definitely a perception from female travellers that they feel safer in spaces that are, where there's more effort has gone into supporting that space, making it better lit, more convenient, more integrated, and that has then increased patronage by women travellers.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of build on what you both have shared. I think it's an interesting challenge to me to address or remove the biases, particularly for people who might act on those biases in a violent way, or perpetrate marginalization. And I was doing some research on the use of public art to create feelings of safety or to normalize different communities. And to me, that's really fascinating, is how can you use the infrastructure itself? Is it just a bike lane, or can you integrate art or even landscape architecture? There's lots of research on, in environmental psych on green space. I mean, the theories are a little cloudy, but as to why green space helps, but it does. And so how do you use other elements of the environment to address safety while also not, creating visual barriers so people don't feel safe? It's a fine balance, but I'm particularly interested in how we use art to facilitate conversations on some of these inequities.
In addition to racial and ethnic kind of equity, we've done some work with age equity, right? So we did some work with AARP and older adults, and it's really interesting because there's older adults is a huge range of a population, but a lot of those people are using digital technologies in fairly limited ways, and so whereas with the 20-something you might lead with the digital, maybe in those populations you're really leading with the physical, and the physical pieces aren't only can I see that I can find a scooter, because they might not be interested in a scooter, right? But can I see an easy way of crossing the street? Can I see a way of getting to that bus stop? Can I see when I get off of when an Uber is going to come pick me up, is there a clear place where I should be finding it, right? So there's all these other physical cues that again, in populations that are not the young tech enabled group, all the physical world is even more important.
Prior to my PhD, I actually spent 5 years working as an occupational therapist in community mental health. So I worked with elderly people and people with disabilities who I saw firsthand how poor infrastructure really was a health issue for them. It caused loneliness. It I think contributed to a sedentary lifestyle. And so the notion of universal design, I think, is really important. I know there's some conversations about universal design and how we need a different approach, but in occupational therapy school, essentially it's how do you design an environment to ensure everybody, and I know Gil Penalosa talks about the 8 to 80 city, so how can a child to someone who's 80 years old be able to navigate an urban environment safely and have their needs met?
Which I think that kind of points to the idea that some of the things that we're talking about are not new. They're not like shared mobility or new mobility or the like whiz bang tech transportation pieces. They are like things that we know exist and are important issues, and we've maybe haven't done such a great job in a lot of places, but we know these things are important, right? And I keep on thinking, with all the work around shared mobility, transit still needs to be the backbone of all these things, right? And like I often think about shared mobility as a way of extending transit, right? Yes, it can be some of the movement on its own, but transit still being the most important piece. We know a lot of these things, what needs to happen. It's just we haven't been so great about doing that. And I'll mention one other point related to that is when we talk, and I think Antonia and Zabe both have made points that related to this a lot, which is that when you think about the physical environment, the automobile cares the least about the physical environment, right? You can drive through some pretty crappy areas and you're not that bothered by it. As you get into other modes, particularly pedestrians, the physical environment has to be good enough that it doesn't feel threatening, right? So it's almost that, I think Antonia was talking a little bit about, the push and pull between different modes, and there's competition for all these modes. Maybe Robin was saying that, right? The physical environment does not weigh equally in all those things, right? The car is the most forgiving of your physical environment. And so we've been able to make, some pretty not nice areas that the car is still happy to drive through. Whereas all these other modes that we want to have, that we really want to promote, they're totally dependent on having physical infrastructure that feels safe, that feels welcoming. And so therefore it's almost, the technology is really important, but we really need to make physical infrastructure that makes people feel welcome, or else we're not going to get these shifts that we're hoping for.
Yeah, and I think if you get that right, then things like loneliness and isolation could be addressed, because these spaces could become social spaces which people really enjoy spending time in. I wanted to go back, if I could, on that point that Robin was making about the art and evolving local communities, but then the kind of contrast with that with the universality and the need to get standards. We've developed standards for mobility hubs in the UK. But one of the points that we put in that, in terms of all the practical things, but it is community consultation, because although we have some standard ideas, all hubs should be tailored, we believe, to the local surroundings. And I'm interested in how that actually needs to be done, not just in terms of the community needs, but the local culture, so that spaces really feel like they belong to the culture rather than being planted and imposed by, the city authorities. I'm interested in any of your thoughts on
that. I agree wholeheartedly. I think there's a huge component of making sure that we're picking up the cues that are cultural from folks in the various different communities, and making sure that there's a flavor of that community and all the different elements that we design. But I think part of it goes back to our approach, right? Like, a lot of our approach is focused on 9 to 5 hub and spoke commutes of office workers. And that comes back even to the technology that we design, right? We're thinking mostly of, who the tech user is, and really focused on how that particular type of user is going to interact with the products that are produced, as well as the transportation choices that they have. But that's really, in most cities, like 20, 30% of trip making. And we really need to expand our sphere. We need to be thinking beyond that, and to make sure that we're incorporating how families are going to navigate the different spaces, how different types of users are going to navigate the different types of spaces, and how we use our urban spaces in particular over the course of the day, right? If we focus on 9 to 5 office workers, I would think the pandemic has shown us that they are the most flexible user, right? They can simply work from home. All of that changes. So what do we do now? And how do we send those visual cues and technology cues that are more consistent with the types of changes we want to see going forward, so that we are using road space in a way that makes sense in the middle of the day, and that, again, is picking up on the local cultural cues? And also, how are we using shared mobility? I mean, this has been flexible, again, and we've seen this throughout the pandemic, that people have started biking and scooting more. How do we devote more on-street space to the movement or storage, so that they see, as Nico was saying, when they walk out of their house or their office, hey, look, I can just pick up, a shared bike or a scooter right here because it's easy to park or what have you, or to pick it up. All of these things mean expanding the way that we think about the user and where the user is going and how they need to get there. We saw, bus changes in many different cities because buses are more flexible than trains. Yet we consistently see, at least in my work when I was with the city, where people want more train services. And we need to really change the way we think about transit, how we integrate people's uses, so that they don't just have to say, this is my only choice. I only need to drive, or I'm only a pedestrian, or I'm only a biker. People need to be able to make integrated choices. And I think that's how technology can help us most. But we need to prioritize the other modes so that we're not solely focused on, those commute trips by car.
I saw a question from Kelly Coyner asking about how you can make mobility hubs more connected to transit and more welcoming, more socially welcoming. And I think going back to some of the things that were said before, like on the one hand, a mobility hub is a place where you transfer between modes, right? Great, right? I got off my bus and now I can take a scooter or, a bike or whatever. Fantastic. But it's also just a place, as is discussed before, just a place of signaling of like, here's where transportation options happen, right? So that I go to that place to figure out what it is, how it is I'm going to move around, right? So transit centers do this a lot for us as well. I don't know exactly which way I'm going to get there, but I know that there's a bunch of lines that go there. Let's go over there, right? And you can almost think about these hubs. So the way to think about them as social places is don't only think about the logistics of transportation. Yes, they're a place that you go from get on one mode or leave on another mode or transfer, but they're also like places, you start thinking about them as third places. It's can there be a community board there? Can there be some kind of little shop there or larger shops, right? Could you have a plaza? Could you have a place to sit? Like you can almost think of these as mini transit oriented developments, right? So these are places that are going to attract more people. So let's put some things that attract people there. For some communities, right, in different types of developments, you could be like, that's where your mailboxes should be, right? So start grouping things that group people and then give people things to do in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing examples develop now where people are putting in, say, little community gardens, edible beds, or play areas, or those small library boxes, shared books that you can pick up. And they just make the area fun and interesting to be there, as well as sort of highlighting and helping to promote those services. I think that's something that operators have really found when they played with putting parklets in around their bike share stations or artwork. It's a way of kind of actually saying, hey, look, here's some shared services that are going on, and putting them front and center ahead of the private car.
Yeah, I think. Whoops. Yeah, so I think when I was living in London, it was really interesting. I talked to someone who helped design or was involved in the redesign of King's Cross Station, and the third space was exactly what they're kind of speaking to. And I've been in many bus stations, some nice to be in, some that you want to leave right away. And I think one lens to use on that is, how do you create a dignified experience for people? And I was having a conversation with a friend in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I did my PhD, and they were doing a lot of work on their transit. They just invested in light rail. I think they're they're the smallest city in Canada, that has LRT, which is impressive. But a lot of people were complaining about bus rapids, which some people might see as a revenue source, but was actually obfuscating the vision outside, the view outside of the bus or the LRT car. Sunlight wouldn't come in, but a lot of people would actually report getting motion sickness. And to me, it was just this really interesting contrast, or challenge of how do you address, an underfunded transit system while still ensuring that the people who use it don't feel like they're using a moving advertisement to get around that makes them feel unwell. Which kind of brings me to, I saw Kelly Corner asked, can you elaborate on the way my OT experience revealed the impact of infrastructure on health? I mean, really briefly, dignity again was a lens I used for that. We talked about the notion of dignity encounters just in the one-on-one work that we would do with people. So if you're working with somebody, typically someone who was institutionalized in a mental health hospital, they had a history of, institutionalization and oppression. And so naturally, they had a lot of experiences that would violate their dignity. So as therapists, we would do our best to create environments where we supported someone's presence, honor their presence and speak to them in a way that, showed them that we cared about their dignity. And I wrote a paper about how you could use that lens on the urban environment and how create dignity encounters within the city. So having someone, requiring someone to press a beg button to cross the street, to me, is an example of an undignified urban environment, or a roadway like the one that you can see behind me here, which is the road I lived on for the entirety of my PhD. A very loud road, but it was cheap to live there, affordable. And what's interesting is the whole community was split by this. They actually widened this roadway behind me because they built an LRT track on a parallel street close by, and they were scared that they would people were going to be stuck in traffic or something. So they narrowed one street and widened another, and this road, Strode, basically became a moat. And people spoke to how they didn't cross Weber Street, and it literally divided the community. I didn't find myself crossing it either. And so, you know, the whole time you could see in the back in the distance, there's some traffic lights, and probably three times that distance is where the next traffic light was to cross. So the whole experience was really guided towards cars. And if you were a pedestrian or a wheelchair user or a cyclist, it was very apparent within the design of the environment as to, you know, how you are valued, and those have impacts on people's psychological health and just basic things like leaving their house for groceries and eating well. So there's so many impacts that the infrastructure has, but those are a few brief points.
I just want to pick up on that a little bit because, you know, obviously as an urban designer and a street designer, I'm kind of appalled that we would narrow and widen a road at the same time that we're building an LRT, which kind of defeats the purpose, but that's a different discussion. But I do think that there's an element of, you know, people being physical beings, and I see there's another question here about access to health, education, and fresh food. And again, you know, right now we have systems that are mostly keyed to how do people get to work? You know, when we collect census data, we collect journey to work data. We just don't think about access to food, and food security is huge. Access to education, you know, how many of our community colleges are on a transit network, for example? I happen to know the answer is less than 50%, which is insane. You know, how do people get to hospitals when they need to? If everyone has to drive to the hospital, you know, even if they're not in an emergent situation, that means that we still have to provide additional, you know, parking services for them. So we do need to make sure that we're providing access to a whole range of different uses. But I think another component of that is making sure that we have greenery incorporated into our urban spaces. We have this feeling like we need to design mobility hubs that are completely clean and pristine and sleek, but some of the most beautiful spaces have, you know, hanging gardens, or they have green spaces that, you know, they have sort of rain gardens or what have you, incorporated into the actual urban design and the roadway itself. And we need to get back to that. Part of it is the climate challenge that we're facing, but as human beings, we don't want to have metal around us all the time. We actually do want to see green space. Obviously, my background, I really love green spaces. But I think it's important to make sure that we don't forget that things don't need to be entirely separated all the time, that we can have integrated spaces because we live integrated lives.
And I'd say, picking up on one of the questions from the Q&A or chat, I don't know where this one came in, but talking about placemaking, and like, yes, absolutely. Like, I think we need to think about these, you know, as urban designers, you always kind of start with placemaking. And if you think about a mobility hub and first think about it as a place, right, that you know, has meaning to people, that there's identity there. Oh, and then it also has this transportation options, which on the one hand are a benefit that it's giving, but it's also like a magnet, right? Fantastic. That's the way to approach these things, right? Not as transportation things that you're trying to window dress with placemaking. Now, how do you do placemaking these things? Well, the same way you do placemaking everywhere, which is there's no one way, right? There's a million ways, but it depends on, you think about what kind of activities you have going on there, what kind of activities you could have going on there. You talk to the people in there and ask them what kinds of things they want, right? You try to reflect the community in and answer some of their needs and like build off of some of their interests in this. And that can be everything from artwork to programming to, you know, just places to sit, to green spaces, Zabe was saying. Like, it really just depends. But I think it's not that there's a formula for how to do it. I'd say there's not a physical formula for how you do it, but maybe there's a formula of like, start with placemaking as the goal and talk to people who are there about what it is they're looking for in these areas, and then help make those things happen, right? It's almost like a Jan Gehl approach to mobility hubs as opposed to like just a transportation need approach. Yeah,
we did a study in the Vancouver, the PPS Pro Place Pro Bike Pro Walk meeting in 2016, where we looked at, we worked with the city of Vancouver and an urban design consultancy, and we basically took 100 people out on a walk around the city and then measured their responses to different urban interventions, from green space to paint like a rainbow crosswalk, to a back alley that was landscaped. Oh gosh, I have a dog here. That's my friend's dog. Yeah, you'll want to grab her. That's good. She's really cute. And we found, what was interesting to me, the biggest, the construct that was most, something I think cities can consider is the notion of psychological ownership. And I think that's tied to placemaking and place attachment. But one concrete example of psychological ownership is how much can someone change a space? You know, I think Zabe made the point of, hyper, well-designed environments converge on being sterile. And so where does character exist? How does a community know it's theirs? Can they paint the walls? Can they move the furniture around? Is the furniture designed with defensive or hostile architecture in it to quietly signal that homeless people shouldn't be there, or at least lie on the benches? There's all sorts of little subtle things about our environment that I think when we talk about placemaking, fundamentally, when a space turns from a physical sheer space to a place which has a psychological attachment, to ensure that works for everybody, how do you create a sense of malleability, and to bring back the concept of affordances, how do you ensure that a space can be used in many ways, but also by many people?
Yeah, before we move on it, sorry, Benji, just one other thing that I would say is that a lot of times when we think about these spaces, we don't integrate equity. And I want to make sure that it's 100% clear that these are spaces that also need to be green, because in a lot of cases, low income and marginalized communities, immigrant communities, don't have access to green spaces, don't have access to the sort of full range of quality of life, because we think for some reason that, we just need to make sure that we're improving the way they get around the city, or we need to improve their housing or what have you. And we create these silos for how people live their lives. And in a lot of places, there aren't enough parks in low income communities. There aren't enough, schools or what have you, or the route to school doesn't have enough lighting, or whatever that might be. And so we need to make sure that it's actually more critical that we incorporate these factors into design for marginalized communities, and not less so, because in many cases they need it more, not less.
So I'm going to come in with a question, because I love the conversation. I'm hesitant to step in on the placemaking. But here's a question. The attendees we have are either from government, so you get a lot of questions about how do we do this, and also a lot of the technology transportation companies. And so asking a question for them, how should they be thinking about it? Because they all think about the app and how it's so convenient and you can get it on demand wherever you need to get it. But how should they be thinking about physical places and mobility hubs, and what should they be working on?
I think a key thing that we're grappling with in the UK at the moment is bringing different mobility providers together and the different business models together to collaborate. They're used to responding to tender opportunities from cities individually, and now they're coming out collaborative as combined opportunities. And so that's a kind of new thing. Who leads? How does it manage? Who takes responsibility for different bits? Which parts of the management of that space can be done? Can be shared out, and that's something that's not really being worked on yet. But I hope that we'll see a lot more collaboration and streamlining, because these kind of services don't often make great deals of money, so we want them to be sustainable, and so this might be an opportunity to help that.
I'll just jump in really quickly. It's interesting to see what's happening in Canada. This is a very old bus service. The Greyhound was the way that people got around rural Canada, and they just basically went under, and all these people who don't have cars are basically screwed. And so when it comes to the role of private companies, I think that's just something that we need to consider, is what happens if they go under. And how do you, I think, like Antonia said, support them to be sustainable, recognizing that the profit margins aren't that big. And if we use that lens, are there ways to bring in the community and have the community own these sorts of programs that the city doesn't want to, take them on themselves?
I would say a little bit of what I was saying before, which is, what should you do? Well, you should not approach this as a transportation problem. You should approach this as a transportation problem that has an important transportation component to it, and start with like community and equity first, and then figure out how you incorporate these things. So you should probably have an urban designer be part of it, and someone who's like works on community outreach as part of a project. When you're creating a mobility hub, the lead should probably not be the transportation provider, right? So it's a little bit of reframing what you're trying to do, and what the goal is, right? The goal is not simply to get people on this mode of transportation. The goal is to do all these other things and then also that mode of transportation is going to be working. Again, I go back to like the way we think about transportation oriented development. Yes, it supports transportation, but when it really works, it's because it has all these other components that make it a great place. So start with that.
Go ahead, Zabe.
I think the other component that we don't talk about enough is that there's this inherent separation between the public sector and the private sector. And there's some sort of competition that's perceived between them. Like, government is failing, so the private sector needs to step in, or the private sector didn't do it quite right, or I don't trust them, or what have you, so the government needs to step in. We could actually approach this by saying, how do we build on our strengths, right? There are very different reasons why we would go with a government or private sector. And I'm not necessarily saying it has to be a public-private partnership, but understand what are the differences in how these different types of organizations move through delivering projects, and how do we build on them, rather than saying, technology can replace the bus. We don't need to ride the bus, take Uber instead. It's like, no, how does Uber enhance your experience getting around by bus or bike or what have you? The other thing is, and specifically for governments, I think a lot of the time, the process is part of the reason that we tend to sort of look to the private sector, because it can take so long to get things off the ground with government. And so we really need to figure out, and there are lots of different organizations working on this, including my own, obviously, what are the ways that we can streamline the process? What are the ways that we can have more local control? It's not always about more funding, which is a lot of people are focused on right now, but also, how can we shorten the time to benefits? How do we get projects off the ground quicker? And some of that might mean farming out different components to private sector, but some of it might mean actually looking at our underlying processes and systems and figuring out how do we make this shorter so that we can get things on the ground sooner.
Picking up on that, Zabe, as we enter our last 2 minutes, right, what's your advice to governments, right, as they're trying to encourage more shared use mobility, as they write contracts or permits for the shared mobility providers? We've seen requirements for data. We've seen requirements for service in particular areas. How do they then start making requirements on a much more finer detail in terms of places? And so I open that to everyone as kind of last piece of advice before we close the panel.
I would say if a city is leading on a development of a shared mobility scheme, that they should be also leading on the development of the space, because they tend to own and control much of the space. It's not often the providers can have much control over that. I mean, there certainly should be requirements in terms of the quality of the infrastructure that's put in. We've totally moved away now from free-floating, dockless chaos to geofenced or physically marked out hubs, and lots can be done in terms of enhancing that space, as we've been talking about. But I think I would say that the city should lead in terms of coordination of that across the whole area.
I would say one of the things that would be great is ask them, right? So don't say like, you have to have, one community board for every 3 docking stations. Say, a really important piece of us, of what we do, and the way that we will continue to evaluate how our partnerships are going, is that these mobility hubs are also places. What is it that you can do? What ideas are you bringing that can help us develop, create really vibrant places in the areas that we've also got your docking stations, or your touch points, whatever it might be. and have that be part of the criteria for, you know, if you have open competitions for different things. I mean, you are, on the one hand, you will garner a lot of ideas. On the other hand, you're also signaling like, hey, this is important to us. This is something you need to think about. And, you know, gather examples of where it's working well and bring those things here.
I can jump in. You know, just from my perspective as a psychologist and a neuroscientist who studies cities, I think there are all sorts of ways that we can capture data that really gets at, you know, the psychological experience, but also gets at equity and well-being. And so when governments are working with, you know, private corporations or whoever to build this infrastructure, it's how do you use this lens to really, you know, and consultation, I think, is an important process and tool for that. But there's other things that we can do to really measure these impacts and then help that inform policy.
Yeah, and I agree with all of those things. I think the final thing that I would say is that tie them together, right? We set out these goals and we set out, you know, our vision or our values or what have you, and then we set data out, but we don't show people how those two things are connected. And a lot of times we'll say, okay, well, here's the program, and then here's how it measures on equity. Center the thing that you care about most and tie those two together so that people can see how the metrics matter, how the data matters, and build stewardship, build trust, build transparency, so that both the city and the private partners, as well as even the community, can really understand how and why these projects are important and how effective they are.
And on that note, thank you so much. This was an excellent, excellent panel and excellent conversation. I know the attendees can't clap, but they're all clapping. Thank you to the panelists for walking us through all of these amazing ideas that we need to be considering.